Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's program, Bridging Generations, the Future of Intergenerational Wealth and Culture Shifts, with author and social psychologist, Dr. Jean Twenge. I'm Rachel Gill, the Director of Family Governance and Education here at Cresset, and I'm thrilled to introduce Jean today. As many of you know, Cresset is an independent, boutique, multifamily office and private investment firm with more than $50 billion in assets under management. We work closely with families to deliver comprehensive financial planning and personalized family office solutions to meet lifestyle needs, from complex wealth management to more nuanced work of identifying and supporting long-term goals and values. The Family Governance and Education team specifically aims to foster deep and meaningful connections across multi-generational families in order to achieve those long-term goals and build lasting legacies. We believe this work starts with empathy and understanding family members who may view the world differently. So whether you're a baby boomer or a millennial, you may not be happy about the stereotypes that come with being a member of your generation. For example, baby boomers are often blamed for everything from inflation to the housing crisis, while millennials are branded as entitled and lazy. Meanwhile, people perceive Gen Z as being overly sensitive and unable to function as adults in the workforce. Why these stereotypes exist and whether there's any truth to them is something we would like to discuss today with Dr. Jean Twenge, author of Generations, the real differences between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silents, and what they mean for America's future. Plus, we'll dive into the great wealth transfer, which is beginning to take shape as baby boomers who currently hold 53% of all the wealth in the United States start to pass down an unprecedented $140 trillion to their heirs. The implications for Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z are massive, as this wealth transfer could dramatically change not only the economy, but the financial futures of millions of households, with further implications for how generations relate to each other in years to come. We're excited to welcome Jean here today to share her insights into the future of America's generational landscape and dive into how to best prepare for the transformative changes ahead. So with that, I want to introduce my colleague, Managing Director of Family Governance and Education, Whitney Webb, who will be leading today's conversation with Jean.
Thanks, Rachel, and welcome, Jean. I'm so excited for this. I loved your book, and I want to dive right in. On one of the first pages of your book, you said, when you were born has a larger effect on your personality and attitudes than the family who raised you does. And I'd love to know why does this have such an outsized influence on how we all experience the world?
Yeah, well, there's really two pieces to that quote. Well, one is that psychology studies have found that the family environment doesn't have as big of an impact on personality traits and values as we might think. Of course, it has an influence, but it's just not as big as people think. That genetic influences and peers, have a bigger impact. And the generational piece, so when you were born, really does have a big impact because it's about culture. So growing up now is so completely different from growing up in the 1950s or the 1980s or even the 2000s. It's like growing up in another culture or another country. That's what makes generational differences happen, is those cultural changes. And, I think most people can reflect, looking at people either older or younger than themselves and realize just how different the world was or is, when they are young compared to previous generations or the generations younger than them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. And I think before we dig into questions, would you mind giving us just a brief overview of the 6 generations that are laid out in your book?
Sure. So I start with the silent generation. So that's the oldest generation with a living quorum in the US today. So that's those born roughly 1925 to 1945. And their name is somewhat of a misnomer. I mean, it came about because they tended to marry young and have children young and were around during a period of relative stability. the 1950s, say early 1960s. However, then that changed, and they were actually the leaders of the civil rights movement, of the feminist movement, of the movement for gay rights. Two of its most famous members are Martin Luther King Jr. and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So that really kind of puts it in perspective. A lot of the things that people associate with boomers were actually silent.
Yeah, they weren't so silent.
Exactly. So they changed a lot of the laws and the expectations. And then boomers came along. And it's not that boomers did nothing, because what boomers did is they took those changes in the laws and they changed hearts and minds. They lived those changes in equality, for example, and really changed those norms definitively. So boomers are those born between about 1946 and 1964. So they were really at the forefront of a lot of those changes that moved the focus away from social rules and more onto the rights of the individual. Then comes Gen X. So that's folks born between about 1965 and 1979. So at the beginning, when Rachel was talking about, oh, the stereotypes of boomers and millennials, I'm a Gen Xer myself, and I'm like, yep, Gen X got left out. We're used to it, but we like it because we fly under the radar. So Gen X is kind of a unique generation in that, we are between those two larger generations, boomers and millennials, but we have some distinguishing characteristics. Like, we were really the last generation to grow up pre-internet. So we kind of have a foot in both camps, that we had a childhood, without the internet. But then as young adults, many Gen Xers founded a lot of internet companies like YouTube and Google, for example. So then we have millennials, those born 1980 to 1994. So they were the first to really grow up with internet and instant messenger and things like that. So Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, is a famous millennial. And so they grew up with the kind of the first wave of social media, which is very different from the second wave. And most did not have a smartphone when they were teenagers. So millennials really hit the peak of a lot of the increase in individualism. And so had a very positive views of themselves, self-confidence, optimism, really distinguishes millennials. Then Gen Z, those born between about 1995, and we don't know where it's going to end yet, but I'm guessing 2012 or so. And really sudden shift between millennials and Gen Z, because Gen Z is much less optimistic, much more pessimistic. Mental health issues like depression started to really increase. And they were the first generation to spend their entire adolescence in the age of the smartphone. And that had ripple effects on, say, how they socialize, a lot less likely to spend time with friends in person, more likely to spend time online. Probably one of the reasons why more are depressed and anxious. So then after Gen Z is the generation some people call alphas. I'm not a huge fan of that term, or just the letters for generations in general, because it's like, oh, Z, that's the last letter of the alphabet. What do we do now? I guess we got to go back to the beginning and use the Greek alphabet. They're just not very descriptive. They're kind of derivative based on previous groups. So I call that next generation, those born 2013 and later, polars, after melting polar ice caps and political polarization. I'm guessing it's not going to catch on, but it does describe their experience a little bit better. Generational conflict starts very early these days. Apparently, Gen Z is already criticizing alphas, and alphas are already criticizing Gen Z.
Wow.
Gen Z is now calling alphas crusty iPad kids, apparently.
Huh.
So,
Hadn't heard that one.
yep, and it is true. That's the first generation to never know a world without the iPad. And apparently, they don't wash their hands before they use it, which is why it gets crusty.
Oh, okay. I was wondering where the crusty came in. All right. All right. Well, I'm a millennial, so I'm used to getting a lot of flack from my generation, but it sounds like that's just going to get worse. So for the polars.
Well, it's at least starting younger.
Yeah, yeah. What I found so interesting about the book is, whenever I've heard about the difference between generations in the past, it's generally thought that attitudes are shaped by world events. So whether it's the Great Depression, the Vietnam War, but you say that technological change has much of a bigger impact. How so?
Yeah, because those traditional theories, they focus on events. They say, how old were you when the Great Recession happened, or when COVID hit, or when World War II occurred, or the Vietnam War, or these things. But the thing is about major events, they do have an impact, but it's not quite as much on day-to-day life, with a couple of exceptions, World War II and the COVID pandemic being those exceptions. But they tend to be short-term, and they tend to not really shape people's values or behaviors as much as technology. Because if you think about, why is it different to live now compared to 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago? The answer to that is very clearly technology. The technology that we live with has really radically changed our lives. And not just smartphones and not just social media, but things like faster transportation, better medical care, labor-saving devices like washing machines. That's what's really caused a sea change in our lifestyles. And it's, of course, not just the direct effects of technology, it's also its downstream effects. So things like individualism, I already mentioned that, more focus on the self and less on social rules. That can happen with more technology because people can be more independent and they have more leisure time to focus on themselves. Then the other downstream effect is people live longer, and technological innovation means people need more years of education. The life cycle slows down from infancy to old age. People take longer to grow up and longer to grow old. So it's known as a slow life strategy. So that's another thing that has a big impact on generational change.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that struck me about the technological change as well, you mentioned that one of the biggest shifts was the introduction of the television, and new ways that people define success. And I found this really interesting. A big part of how we work with families is helping understand the different ways that people and generations define a successful life, and what are their goals. And so from your research, is any insight onto how each generation might define a successful life?
Yeah, so for that, we can look to some of the survey data on life goals. And just to put this in context for how we know these things, most of what I do for understanding generational differences is draw from nationally representative surveys, usually of young people. So there's one that's done of high school seniors, there's another that's done of entering college students, and both ask about life goals in one way or another. And they have some results over the decades that are kind of counterintuitive, because there's been the rumor, for example, that millennials care a lot about meaning and purpose. But when you take age out of the equation and you're looking at 18, 17, 19-year-olds, at the same age across generations, going back to the 1960s and 70s, the picture's quite different. It's actually boomers who really cared about things like developing a meaningful philosophy of life or having meaning and purpose in life in those surveys. And then those went down from boomers to Gen Xers to millennials. And instead, what's gone up is a focus on financial success. So there's a question about, how important do you think it is to become, quote, very well off financially? And that's asked of the entering college students. And that value has gone way up from the 1960s when it was boomers to more recently when it's millennials and Gen Z who are answering the question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And, I think a lot of the clients that we work with, they'll be passing down wealth to the next generation. So there's even another layer of kind of complexity there. And this is oftentimes called the great wealth transfer. Bloomberg estimates that the baby boomers who hold 53% of the wealth at the moment will pass down $140 trillion to younger generations in the coming decades. So I'm curious, given what you know about each generation, well, let's think particularly, I guess, about millennials and Gen Z right now, who are going to be the beneficiaries. How
Some
might
Gen Xers as well.
And Gen Xers, sorry, yeah. And so how might this play out?
Yeah, so it's a little tough to tell, of course, but I think there's a couple factors that will have an impact. And one is just longer lifespans. That life expectancy is now pushing 80. And for people who have already lived 70 or so, it's even higher when you just look at the actuarial tables. And given that, and given that most silent and boomers, silents and boomers had their children relatively young, it means that people will be inheriting later. That they'll be in their 50s or even 60s by the time that wealth is transferred. So I think that, at least on average, that's going to be one change that might have an impact. And, another is as people live longer and, healthcare improves, but also becomes more expensive, there will be more of that money is going to end up being spent on healthcare, memory care facilities, and things like that. So I don't know if the folks who made those estimates have taken that into account.
Yeah.
Perhaps they have, but that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. It might not be as great of a wealth transfer as we think.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious though, based on what you do know about the inheriting generations, and you mentioned that the slow life, kind of shift that we've had where people are they're becoming independent and acting like adults later in life. Should we be concerned about how they might handle this wealth, or how do you think this will play out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's put this in context a little bit. So when I'm talking about the slow life strategy, when it comes to young adulthood, what that usually means is people finish their education later, just because more people go to college and graduate school. So they settle into their permanent careers later. They tend to get married later, and they tend to have children later. So this is another place where this, slow life strategy as an extension of technological change comes in, because there's a lot of talk of, oh, millennials are doing all that stuff later because of the Great Recession. No, those trends have been going on for decades, which also means they're not going to change. It also means, pretty much despite anything that happens with the economy or the generations turning over, it's pretty likely that those trends are going to continue. And so far, they certainly have with Gen Z, also marrying later, having kids later, all of those things. So it's very important, I think, to put that in context, that does not mean that people are necessarily immature. It just means they're taking longer to grow up and longer to do these adult things. With that said, it does mean that your average 18-year-old has had less life experience than they did a few generations ago, because at that age, they're less likely to have a driver's license or go out of the house without their parents as much, or have had a paid job or go on dates or any of those things. And then by the time they get to 22, what I hear when I give talks on college campuses from staff is they say, I have more and more students who can't make even simple decisions without texting their parents. And again, I'm not trying to say this as a place of criticism, but from a place of empathy. They just haven't had those life experiences. They're taking longer. So, that may point in the direction of, maybe some of that wealth transfer happens later because 25 isn't what it used to be. On the other hand, it could just be more about, look, we have to realize that they might not have had a job in high school or even in college, that they don't have as much of these life experiences. They have more life experiences online, but maybe less in the real world. And so it might be just a matter of more communication, more education, about all of the aspects of wealth and personal finance.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, I think, a big part of how we work with families. I do think that communication is, empathy, communication, and education are really at the heart of the work that we do, because I think, to your point, it's not about judging the younger generation, because like you said, this has been happening for a long time, right? It's a trend that's continuing. It's not about being lazy.
That's right.
It's just a sign of the times. And I think that empathy, needs to happen both ways.
Yeah, I totally agree, because I think it's very tempting for older generations to say, look at millennials or Gen Z and say, when I was your age, I was already married with 2 kids. And yeah, but that was because things were different then. It was a different situation. Not as many people went to college. People did marry younger and had kids younger. And there's trade-offs. You know, there's advantages and disadvantages to both systems. They're not all good or all bad. The slow life strategy, the fast life strategy. The psychologists who developed those theories specifically say they're a product of a particular place and time, and they're not all bad or all good. And I think that's really, really useful for generations understanding each other, that, you know, older generations have to realize that, you know, things are different, but then younger generations too shouldn't look at, you know, their parents or grandparents and go, what the hell were you thinking? You know, getting married at 19 or something like that, because that's how it was then. And these are big cultural changes. And the whole idea of like, you know, whose fault it is or who's to blame for things, I think that is so counterproductive and also not accurate, just because we are all living these big cultural changes. We're all in this together. And we have to, yeah, okay, if somebody is criticizing, maybe we need to put the kibosh on that, but it's about understanding. It's about empathy. That's why I study generational differences. That's why I write these books and give talks and do interviews like this, is to try to put it in that perspective. So it's not about fault or blaming or criticism. It's about understanding.
Yeah, I love that so much. And that's, I think, why I love your books. I mean, I think we need to bring, I guess, a little bit of stoicism to it all. It's like, who are we to judge what's good and bad? And, you know, can't we just, it's just a little bit different, right? Well, and so I want to dig in a little bit more to each of the generations and how they're faring economically today. You wrote an article for The Atlantic entitled "The Myth of the Broke Millennial," which, I mean, this is what I hear from my peers all the time, right? Like, well, we have no chance to live up to how our parents were, and you know, there's all of the articles around we're spending all of our money on avocado toast and everything. But can you tell us about the myth of the broke millennial and why millennials have felt so poor?
Yeah, so there's kind of a deep story here. So, you know, it begins around the time of the Great Recession when, yeah, graduating into the Great Recession, that was very tough for a lot of millennials. They got a much slower start than people born, you know, 5 or 10 years before. On the other hand, it wasn't 100% unique. People said the exact same thing about Gen Xers when there was a recession in the early 90s. They would never catch up to their parents. You know, it was lots and lots of doom and gloom. And of course, we know what happened next. Late 90s, the economy took off. Exact same thing happened with millennials. Yeah, we had the Great Recession, but then the economy took off. So early on, there was a lot of talk about how maybe millennials are going to be a lost generation when it comes to income and wealth. And so the St. Louis Fed, that's the group that often looks into this, came out with a big report, I think, based on data from maybe 2015, showing that that was probably going to be the case, at least up to that point. And then that started to change because the economy kept getting better. By about 2018 or 2019, the median incomes for young adults were actually at all-time highs. And yes, that's corrected for inflation. So when that Atlantic article came out, the two most common reactions were, okay, now corrected for inflation. It was already corrected for inflation. And do you really think the Atlantic would publish that if it wasn't? But that was the most common thing. And the second most common was, you must be wrong. But here's what happened next. Even at that point, when that article came out about, what was it now, like 18 months ago or so, the St. Louis Fed was showing that millennials were on track to catch up in terms of wealth, because income and wealth are different, right? That their incomes are doing well, but maybe because of other factors like the housing market or something, that their wealth was you know, not quite caught up. But at that point, they were saying, yeah, it was on track. Plus, when you look at the housing market, millennials actually timed it really well, at least older millennials, those born in the 80s, roughly. If they bought a house at a typical time, housing prices were actually really low for most of the 2010s, because they fell during the Great Recession. So if they bought during that time, they were actually getting the deal of a lifetime. And then if they held on to those properties, then after 2019, 2020, when housing prices went up, then they were building a lot of wealth. And it turns out, and we just found this out a couple of weeks ago, there's a big Wall Street Journal article. The St. Louis Fed did an analysis with updated data. Millennials compared to Gen Xers and boomers at the same age actually have 25% more wealth. That's what the St. Louis Fed concluded recently. And I think that's, and they concluded exactly the same thing that I'd sort of anticipated by not anything fancy, just a really simple graph of housing prices, that they built that wealth primarily through housing.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, it was such a strong narrative. It has been such a strong narrative. So to know that it's not correct.
Yeah.
It's,
now it's completely opposite, which is
yeah,
really shocking to a lot of people. And I think it's just because there was a big turnaround. And, in 2015, it was correct, at least in terms of wealth building. It's just then housing went way up.
yep.
And contrary to popular belief, home ownership among millennials was only a percentage point or two behind Gen Xers or boomers at the same age as of 2019,
Wow.
2020. So that's another piece of the picture. The idea that, millennials had missed out on buying houses just wasn't true.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's great. I want to remind the audience, we've got a lot of good questions coming in. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for Jean, please put those in. We'll address them at the end. I want to switch gears and make sure we talk about Gen Z, because this is the most mind-blowing chapter for me. I think I highlighted most of it. And you even, I mean, you wrote a whole book about this generation. But I think the bottom line is the young adults right now are not all right. You found that every indicator of mental health and well-being is more negative among Gen Z since 2012. And I encourage everyone to read the book. The data is pretty astonishing. So what's going on?
Yeah. So, I'd been doing this work on generational differences for a long time, since I was an undergrad in the early 90s. And I get used to seeing changes that were big, but they take a decade or two to get there. And then in that data that around 2011, 2012, things started to change much more suddenly, particularly in that data on adolescence, that more started to say they felt lonely and left out, more started to say they felt like they couldn't do anything right, that their life wasn't useful, they didn't enjoy life. And those are classic symptoms of depression. Clinical level depression started to rise, with the end result that between 2011 and 2019, clinical level depression among teens doubled. And that's before the pandemic. So it's not due to the pandemic. Then that spread to young adults within a couple of years, 18 to 25. Self-harm went up, suicide attempts went up, just everything across the board. So that, of course, begs the question of why? What happened? What happened in the early 2010s that could explain this? And at first, I had no idea. It was a huge mystery. It wasn't lining up with economic trends. The Great Recession was finally over and starting to improve, after that point. It was hard to think of any event that happened then and then kind of kept going across the decade. Then one day I came across a poll and things started to fall into place, that what happened at the end of 2012 is that's the first time the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. It's also around the same time that, especially among the adolescent populations, social media use moved from something that was optional to almost mandatory.
Yeah.
And they started spending less time with friends in person and less time sleeping. So you put those three things together: you're sleeping less, you're staring at a screen more, you're spending less time with friends in person. That's a terrible formula for mental health. And that was the end result: more anxiety, more depression, more loneliness.
Tell me, why does it feel mandatory? Why is it mandatory for
Well,
kids?
what I mean when I say that, just from a more quantitative point of view is
Yeah.
that, say, in 2009, only about half of high school seniors used social media every day. So you could do it or not if it's half and half, right? By the time you get to 2012, especially 2016, 2017, it gets to be 75% or 80%. So then if you're not doing it, you're left out.
Yeah.
It's especially true among at high school, right? Less important as you get a little bit older, but in that population where, status and social life is such a big deal and everybody wants to do what everybody else is doing, then it becomes the social norm.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned in your book, in interviewing some of the Gen Zs, they felt like they, you know, it was going to be a bad either way, right? If they were on
Yeah,
it, it was going to
that's
affect them in a
right.
negative way. If they weren't on it, they were going to be left out and not, be in the same circles as their friends. So
Yeah, that
that
it's a
that
group effect, not just an individual effect. And that
yeah,
isn't often, that's not recognized enough in my view, that it's not just individuals spending a lot more time. It's that the social norm shifted. So like, let's say you didn't want to be on social media and you wanted to live your life like it was 1988 and go out with your friends in person. Who are you going to do that with when the social
yeah,
norm shifted where everybody's at home on Saturday night scrolling through Instagram?
yep. Yeah, and you found data that social media in particular had a much bigger effect on girls.
Mhm.
Um, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so if you look, so first, girls just spend more time on social media than boys,
Mhm.
and they seem to be more impacted by it because the link between hours per day on social media and depression is stronger for girls than for boys in most data sets. And that makes sense when you think about it because the way social status works, especially among teenage girls, social media is like a perfect storm for a lot of those things because it makes popularity into a number. How many likes do you have? How many followers do you have? It tends to quantify how attractive you are physically, and it places a lot of emphasis on physical appearance, which we know from lots of research over decades is a good way to increase anxiety and depression among girls and young women because they don't have a total control over that. So they're being judged, for their appearance, a lot of social comparison, a lot of body image issues as a result.
Yeah. And Jean, this is a topic that I mean almost every client that I talk to is concerned about those who have young kids.
Mhm.
From your perspective, because you've been in this for so long, where do we go from here? What
Yeah.
are there any good options?
Yeah, that's actually going to be my next book, more than
Oh,
likely.
great.
Yeah, so the working title is Future-Proof Parenting: 10 Rules to Help Parents Around Kids and Tech. I don't know. We'll mess with the subtitle a little bit, but that's the general idea. I have 3 adolescent children myself, and they happen to be all girls. So this is my personal life as well as my research life.
Yeah.
And parents are in such a difficult position now because
Mhm.
social media is so unregulated. You don't need
Mhm.
parental permission. They don't verify age. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole every single day to try to keep your kids safe online because they do homework on school laptops. Seriously, I could talk the rest of the hour about this. I won't,
Yeah.
but I
Yeah.
could. But I think we really are in need of more regulation. But before that happens, and who knows when that'll happen, parents need some rules, some guidance. And it's tough because I know it's very hard to say, this is one size fits all and you can't be at all flexible. Of course you can, and of course it's not, but we need a place to start from. So I
Mhm.
think it should be things like number one, no phones in the bedroom overnight. And that's for
Mhm.
adults too, because you're going to sleep
Yeah.
better. We know that from lots and lots of
Mhm.
studies. Or have the kids' phones shut down at bedtime. You can do
Mhm.
that with parental controls. Um, the other thing is the rule in my house now is you get your first internet enabled smartphone when you get your driver's license. So
Mhm.
that serves 2 purposes. Then when you're younger, you don't have social media on your phone. You don't have
Yeah.
internet on your phone. So if you get a phone at all, it's a flip phone or phone designed for kids that doesn't have internet access or social media.
Yeah.
And that helps with the next rule of no social media until age 16. And as I said, it's
Mhm.
tough, for parents to police that, but there's ways that it can be done. And if they at least don't have it on the phone, that helps a lot because
Yeah.
then it's easier, to catch them at it if they're on a laptop, say, and you can block websites on a laptop. You could do that on a phone too, but it's a little bit harder to do that. They don't need social media. There's this perception they have to be on it. And as I said, yeah, there's that idea of being left out and it feeling mandatory and so on. But let's change the social norm. There's other ways for them to communicate, even electronically. They can text, they can FaceTime. My younger kids, who are 14 and 12, they have phones designed for kids, so they can text with their friends. So that's our compromise position. But there's no internet or no social media on those phones.
No, I think that's great. And it sounds like it requires work, right? It requires intention.
It
It
does.
requires the
And
policing, but
honestly, it's too much work, and that's why we need more regulation.
yeah,
However,
in
the free-for-all has not worked.
if you
It
look at the
has not worked.
data,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
worth the effort. I would think.
That's what I believe. And I think we have enough with parental controls and enough options with, say, the phone for kids and things like that now, that it's not as much work as it used to be. So that's good.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I do want to say, we work with, there's a lot of Gen Zs who work at Cresset. I mean, Gen Zs are all over the workplace, and a lot of the time I find them lovely, right? I think
Absolutely, me too.
obviously we've got the stereotypes, and there's the data there. But can you tell us a little bit more about Gen Z in the workplace? I'm sure most people on this call work with Gen Zs. What should we know, other than the social media side of things? What should we know about them to better engage and work alongside them?
Yeah. So by my definition, the oldest of Gen Z are 29. So if they're not in your workplace yet, they're coming very, very soon.
Yeah.
So we really need to understand them. And they are very different from millennials. There's often the perception that, the change is linear. Sometimes the change is linear, between Gen X and millennials. Some of the changes were somewhat linear, but there's a big change between millennials and Gen Z, from optimism to pessimism. I mentioned that. There are some linear changes. So one is in terms of work-life balance. So when you take age out of the equation, look at everybody at the beginning of their careers around, age 18 or so, that's the biggest difference that shows up generationally, is the growth in work-life balance. So if you look from boomers to Gen Xers to millennials to Gen Z, there's been a big shift away from saying, I expect work to be a central part of my life. There's a shift away from saying, I'm willing to work overtime to do a good job. There's an especially sudden shift in just the last couple of years of data post-pandemic. If you look at that survey of the 18-year-olds, those Gen Zers much less likely to say work's going to be a central part of my life and I'm willing to work overtime. So in other words, those TikTok videos about quiet quitting were onto something. And that data that I'm talking about was collected before that. So that was a symptom, not a cause. I think they were picking up on something that was going on, for real on average. So that is a challenge. And I think that's going to be, a source of conflict over the next few years. I was just on a panel with a Gen Zer who makes TikToks about being Gen Z in corporate. And he's like, it's 5 p.m. I'm shutting my laptop. And the Gen X moderator said, if I had done that, I would not be where I am today.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the argument that, has been going on. And again, I think there's not 100% right or 100% wrong on either side. It is true, we probably need some readjustment, of some of these attitudes. On the other hand, if you're not willing to work hard and you still expect to get ahead and get paid a lot, good luck. It really does depend on your perspective. There's a lot of positives too, though. One thing that has changed in that survey, looking at the generations, Gen Z more likely to say they want a job that's directly helpful to others. Empathy has increased among young adults in the last 10 to 15 years. And that really reflects a lot of people's personal experience with this generation too, that they're more empathic. I mean, on the negative side, people say they're sensitive. However, that can be a good thing. in a lot of organizations and a lot of industries, especially anything that's focused on helping other people. I've certainly found this with my undergrads. So the ones I get to know the best are my research assistants, and they're very kind, and they're very nice, and you have to use a softer touch. That is for sure. That also means they'll give that to you in return.
I've found the same, definitely. Um, there was I think I only have time for one more question, but one of the last chapter of your book is really about the future of, what does all of this mean? And I loved your anecdote about the Jetsons, the cartoon that, kind of
Yeah.
predicted what's life going to look like in 2020. And they got some of the technology, correct,
Mhm.
but
Video calls. Yep.
right, but the wife still was staying home
Right.
and, not working. And so I
Yep.
think oftentimes, when we think about technological advancements, we all know that that's here, that's going to continue. But we don't necessarily think about the ripple effects in society. And can you tell us, a few of the points that you mention, and, what does all of this mean for the future?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's always the hard part, trying to predict what happens next. And, I'm always a little bit cautious of that because I am so data oriented. But the great thing is we've got data from very young
A
people.
lot of
So we
it.
can
Yeah.
see a little bit, into the future with that. Some of the surveys, are of people as young as 13 years old. We have a little bit more among the 17 and 18-year-olds. But I think some of the workplace stuff we talked about will continue to play out. One prediction that I have is that the birth rate is going to continue to go down. And that's based partially on what Gen Z is saying in those surveys at 18 about whether they want to have kids. And that question's been asked since the 70s. It's asked two different ways. Just, do you think you're going to have kids? Then under ideal circumstances, would you want to have kids? And both have declined recently. And they've been very high, the percentage say you want to have kids, and especially those who said they'd want to have kids under ideal circumstances. Those have been, really high percentages of 18-year-olds said yes to that for decades. It was virtually unchanged since the 70s until you get that transition from millennials to Gen Z, and then it went down, which is interesting because the birth rate has gone down as millennials have been in those ages. And they said they wanted to have kids at 18, and Gen Z isn't even saying that. So I think those numbers are going to continue to decline, and that has pretty broad ranging implications across demographics, investment, and so on. I think there's some implications for the housing market based on that and some other trends that, with fewer people having kids, then school district might become a little less important when you're talking about real estate, residential real estate. However, I think that houses with a fair amount of square footage might still end up being important. We see that in surveys that um, uh, um, the 18-year-olds are still likely to say that they want to have their own house, single family house, as opposed to say, an apartment or a condo. That hasn't really changed much. It's gone down a tiny bit, but not much,
Yeah.
contrary to popular belief that, that's gone down a lot. Plus individualism pushes for more space for each person, and the trend for working from home. You might
Mm-hmm.
need two home offices, not just one. And so that
Mm-hmm.
that makes me think that at least if people can afford it, that they will still prize square footage.
Yeah. Yeah. And you brought up so many other, great points of the implications of all of this, which is just a really, really interesting thought experience. And, we should all be thinking about this. So I encourage everyone to read the book, and the last chapter is focused on the implications. I wanna close this out before going to Q&A with actually one more question. So kind of zooming back in, we've now talked about the future, but when we look at today, and especially when I look at the families that I work with, um, there's a lot of blame between generations. We heard about millennials blaming boomers for all the problems that they're having, and the housing market, and boomers generally feel the younger generations are entitled, or too sensitive, and so my question is, you know I think we understand a little bit about why there's so much resentment, because I think there was a big misunderstanding. But what are some strategies here to, to ease some of this blame and some of this tension between generations.
Yeah. What I think is really funny is that when there are positive changes or positive outcomes, suddenly nobody's talking about whose fault it is anymore.
Mm.
So like the thing with millennials actually having more wealth, is that the boomers' fault? Right? And because not all change is negative. And it's very tempting to focus on the negative things when that's human nature.
Mm-hmm.
There have been lots of positive changes too. So I think that's one thing to definitely keep in mind. The others, as I mentioned earlier, there's a big changes. We're all participating in this. It's a big dynamic system. It's, you can certainly say, millennials can say, well, we have these attitudes because the boomers raised us. Sure, but you're an adult, there's both perspectives. And there is certainly some truth to generational differences. Not everything is just a stereotype. There are some average differences based on what people say about themselves. So that's the other thing I think we have to keep in mind. That's one reason why I like digging into that data instead of trying to rely on what managers say about employees or older generations say about younger generations. That's perception. That's colored by people's own biases and experiences. But there is some truth to both some of the positives and some of the negatives, for each generation in what they say about themselves. It is actually true that Gen Xers and millennials are more self-confident and optimistic and sometimes even entitled than boomers at the same age. That tended to turn around with Gen Z. They're less confident. So you have to, really look at what they're saying and what the data actually tells us, instead of guessing. And I think that has sometimes been lost in these conversations. Look, I love talking about generations. I love people sharing their experiences. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that. I think that enhances things. But when you see newspaper articles or corporate talks or consultants who aren't actually drawing from data and they're talking about generational differences, I think that's a big problem because people are getting bad information.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not saying, you just have to look at my books because there's other, stuff out there that is also empirical data on these questions. But yeah, let's actually look at what people are saying, preferably at the same age compared to other generations, instead of just relying on stereotypes, instead of just relying on guesses.
Right. That's just kind of furthering the divide.
I think so. I think that's part of the reason there's been these misunderstandings. I mean, that the thing about millennials and finances is a great example. If you just went on stereotypes, just went on perceptions, you would say, oh, millennials are poor, when at least these days, that's not true anymore.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has been amazing. I have so many more questions, but we have even more questions from the audience. So I'm going to let Rachel kick us off there.
Well, thank you both. I think this has been so interesting and enlightening. And we've had a couple questions come in, and Whitney, I might actually pose this question to you to kick off. When, thinking about the great wealth transfer that's coming up, and families are preparing to transition wealth to their kids and grandkids, when is the right time to talk about younger generations, or to talk to younger generations about this wealth transition? What is the right age? And what are some of the financial behaviors of these different generations that we should be aware of?
Yeah, and I can start with kind of how we talk about it with clients, but Jean would love your opinion too. I think the good and the bad answer is I haven't seen that there's an exact right age. I've seen families start the conversation at very different times, and it's worked out well. I do think probably on average, the earlier the better. I think you can talk about wealth, but you have to put it in context. Money is not the only factor of success. Money is not the only factor of happiness. Putting it in that context right off the bat. Also, if there's kind of a large number attached, just remember that your kids and even your teenagers might not understand the scale of that. So waiting until there's some understanding of what life costs, what's the difference between $1 million and $100 million, because that extra zero might not mean anything to your kids. So I think those are two factors to consider. Jean, anything to add there?
I think you're right, at least to start some of the conversation, maybe, high school age or so. But then, by college and then young adulthood, there's a better understanding of what stuff costs. But I think not springing it on someone who's 25 is probably a good idea of it, talking about money and finances when they're younger can be very helpful and to set the stage, and then it's not, a complete surprise.
Definitely. So we've got a ton more questions here. This one's interesting. Because of the slow life strategy, Jean, do you have any advice on young kids working outside the home and the best time to start and encourage kids to do so?
Yeah. And there's some different schools of thought on this. I mean, most of the research in psychology suggests that, teens having some responsibilities, whether it's volunteer work or paid work, can be really beneficial developmentally. And that can help them learn how to make decisions on their own. A lot of those things that I hear from, people who work at colleges that is sometimes missing these days, among those adolescents and young adults. Um, you have to make sure that it's not interfering, with their schoolwork, with them having some time to socialize, especially in person, with extracurriculars and so on. But like that kind of classic summer job can be a really huge learning experience for a lot of teenagers. And so if they can have that experience before they go to college, that can often serve them very well.
And we talked a bit about building empathy across generations. And so we had a question that came in saying, just as boomers need to understand generations X, Y, Z, what can members of those younger generations do to ease the mindsets of the boomers as they prepare to transfer their life's work to their children and grandchildren?
Yeah, it's funny. Like older generations are often very, very interested in understanding younger ones. And then a lot of times younger generations are like, I don't need to understand you, you're gone. It's like it's kind of mean, actually. And I understand, the idea like, okay, we're just moving forward, but it's short-sighted. And it doesn't, give you the full picture of what you really, really need to understand. So I think that has to happen too. And, I think it has to be something where you're going to have a lot of those conversations, and figure out what your shared values are. And because that's what, money and wealth are often about, and how you use it. That's what it comes down to. What are those shared values? And sometimes there's going to be things that are not going to be shared, between, say, Gen Z and millennials and boomers, for example. But there's going to be some things where you can find common ground. And that's obviously the place to focus, is what you do have in common, what you can agree on.
Yeah. And one thing that Rachel and I find is the ability for kind of older generations to share stories with younger generations in a way that's very authentic and not trying to impose those on the next generation, right? I think we all want autonomy. We all want to be able to live out the life that we want. And so I think stories without any sense of expectation or control attached can be so powerful. When you've failed, when you've, just completely not known what to do with your life, like all of the sharing the struggles and sharing how you overcame them can be incredibly helpful, as long as you don't end the story with, and so you should do the same.
Right. But no, I think that's so true. If you ask a room full of adults, like, when did you learn the most about yourself? It's almost always when I failed, when I struggled with something. And I think we moved away from that, as a culture, especially in the messages that we pass down to young people. It's all about perfection and how it always has to be perfect, when that's not how life works. And that's not when you learn the most about yourself. So it's okay to fail.
Yeah. I want to add, there's one very specific question here I want to touch on real quick. You mentioned, the declining birth rate, which has so many implications, for all of us. What are the factors what are the causal factors there for those
Yeah.
decreasing birth rates?
Yeah, the why question. So there's been a lot written about this, a lot of ink spilled on it. So based on the data that I've been able to crunch and a lot of the polls out there and so on, it seems to be individualism. So more focus on the self, less on social rules. Having children is less of a social mandate. And there's more focus on, I want to travel, I want to have time to myself. Because in the polls, the most common reason is usually not finances, it's usually not climate change. It's some version of, I just don't want to, or I want to do other things. So, given that, I think that gives us, again, a guess that that trend is going to continue. And I think might help us, if you want to change it, understand how to change it, understand what might help and what might not help. And I think it's not that economics doesn't have anything to do with it. I think that's in there, but it's not just economics. There's a New York Times article a couple years ago showing that the birth rate declined the most in counties where job opportunities for young women went up the most. So it's that a lot of young women are taking that path and at least putting off having children, or having fewer children because they have more of those job opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And I think that individualism, that kind of plays in as well between the empathy between generations, right? Because I think some grandparents and parents can't understand that,
Right.
or and I think kids on the same hand need to understand why their parents and grandparents didn't value the same thing. So I think that
Right.
that's probably at the heart of a lot of differences.
Yeah. So if you want to talk your kids or grandkids into having kids, well, first that's going to be tough, but telling those stories and those experiences and, I don't know, this is more on a personal note. Before I have 3 children, and before I had children, I would ask older relatives, what are the advantages of having children? And people would look at me like, kind of like deer in the headlights, like, I don't know. And they would talk about all the bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized after I had my first child that what was happening is that the bad stuff is more quantifiable. The good stuff is harder to describe. And when you describe it, you sound like a sap. But it's very meaningful. It's very deep. It's very purpose driven. And we have to get, I don't know. I mean, look, if you don't want to have kids, don't have kids. I'm not, in that extreme pronatalist camp or anything. But I think that it would behoove all of us who have children to communicate the joys as well as the challenges.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's so interesting, though, that the bad is definitely more quantifiable.
Mhm.
Rachel and I are those saps who are constantly trying to talk about the the good. So we're fighting the good fight.
That's true. Well, Jean, thank you so much. We had so many other questions come in that unfortunately we won't have time for today, but encourage everyone to check out Generations, the book. It's a wealth of knowledge in terms of thinking about how generations interact. And Jean, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us today. I think it's incredibly helpful as we think about this idea of building empathy across generations to just deepen our understanding of one another. So appreciate your insights and expertise, and want to thank everyone else for joining the webinar, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.